where Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Russian President Vladimir Putin are in talks right now in the first face-to-face meeting between the two, with a lot on the agenda: the situation in Syria, Lebanon, and perhaps most importantly, the Iranian nuclear deal, with the resumption of talks on the table. Bennett and Putin delivered a statement to the press a bit over an hour ago. Let's hear a bit of what they had to say.
I want to say that your visit coincides with the 30th anniversary since diplomatic relations were restored. In the meantime, Russia and Israel developed truly unique relations. There is every reason for it.
And earlier we spoke with our contributor in Moscow about this situation. Let's hear what she had to say.
The two leaders are now holding closed-door talks after their introductory remarks to the press, where both leaders praised the growing relationship, the friendly ties, and the historic ties as well between Israel and Russia. Of course, there were mentions of the issues that they will be discussing today, namely the situation with the Iran nuclear deal, the tensions in Syria, as well as bilateral ties, namely economic, scientific, and cultural ones that were listed by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Of course, everyone has been watching very closely what the body language has been, because, of course, President Putin had a close personal relationship with Mr. Bennett's predecessor, former Prime Minister Netanyahu. There was some footage released by the Russian agencies of President Putin waiting on the steps of his Sochi residence a little bit impatiently before the arrival of Prime Minister Bennett. And if I were to indulge in a bit of Kremlinology, he was making less eye contact than he sometimes does. But certainly the two leaders did praise the growing ties between their countries, noting the trade growing between Israel and Russia over the past year.
Right, that's really interesting what you said there about the body language, because it did seem a little bit like, Bennett wasn't quite as comfortable maybe as Netanyahu, who used to be there, who was in the Kremlin many times. He kind of sat with a sort of closed body language. Putin was a bit hunched over, maybe even looked a little bored at some point. I don't know. But is that just maybe my imagination from over here? What do you make of that?
That was my impression as well, although Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the talks are happening in a friendly atmosphere, although he had said previously that it does take time to build personal relationships. Right. Of course, President Putin and former Prime Minister Netanyahu met many, many times over the years, and so they did have a good relationship, which was credited for many of the agreements and the cooperation between the two countries, not least on Syria and the deconfliction mechanism in place there to avoid conflict between the two countries.
Right, certainly arriving there in Russia, whether Sochi or the Kremlin, can be a little bit intimidating. It's not easy on the first visit to have that kind of good relationship. And, the Iranian nuclear deal, that's surely one of the major issues between the sides here. Where do you think that's going to go? How critical will that be in the talks?
What was interesting is that the issue of Iran wasn't raised in President Putin's introductory remarks, but of course it was mentioned by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, perhaps suggesting that it is an issue of greater importance to Israel than to Russia, because there are tensions, there is discord between the two countries when it comes to Iran. Russia has been a vocal backer of the Iran nuclear deal and is trying to get those talks back on the table to revive that agreement. But the Israeli Prime Minister came here likely with the expectation that he wants to put some pressure on Russia for some sort of conditions, at least, that it might be able to influence over Iran. Russia has been pretty adamant, at least towards the United States, there should be no added preconditions to the Iran nuclear deal when it does get back to the negotiation table. But certainly that will be one of the main topics of discussion and one of the main tension points between the two leaders.
And for a bit of perspective from the Russian point of view here, let's hear from Vera Michelin-Shapir, visiting research fellow at King's Center for Strategic Communications.
For Putin, this visit is, of course, quite important, and this is why quite early in Naftali Bennett's prime ministership, he is invited to Sochi. It is important because Israel is sort of is sort of in between so many different crossroads and interests that Russia is involved in, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's in the international arena vis-a-vis the United States. So this is not something that the Russians are taking lightly. This is not something that the Russian president is taking lightly, even if his body language seems a little bit maybe bored, but this is something that is quite, we see from Putin quite a lot, and quite a lot actually recently, that he sort of, he presents this kind of a slightly bored look.
Well, he has been doing this for like 20 years at this point. Surely at some point, all of those meetings, it becomes sort of his day-to-day, one may say, like going to the office, and it doesn't mean that he's not dealing with the issues, you're saying.
Yeah. The excitement wears off.
Yes, exactly.
But when you look at the agenda is actually pretty serious. I think that there is a certain the beginning of the sort of the first layer of this is kind of a little bit of psychological profiling, which I'm sure the Russian president, we know that the Russian president is doing. Yes, I mean, he's meeting a new person that is the head of state, that is in the region where Russia used as a sort of arena for power projection. So the Middle East has been in the last couple of years, and in Russia's view, a sort of arena where Russia can come in and reassert itself as an international power to challenge this perception that Russia is a regional power that mainly has interests in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but in the Middle East, Russia is an international power. Of course, this also created a sort of a very intense web of alliances that were already there, but were reinforced by Russia's intervention in Syria, and this is vis-a-vis the regime in Damascus, vis-a-vis Assad's regime in Damascus, as well as vis-a-vis Iran, which has its all sort of myriad of issues. So in that sense, Israel is extremely important in terms of what Israel does or doesn't do in Syria, in terms of how much Israel pushes on the Iran issue. Now, in terms of Russia, I'm sorry?
Right. No, I just wanted to ask a final question, because we have 1 minute before we have to go to the break, really about those Iranian nuclear talks. The Russians are a party to those talks. They're part of the P5+1. So where does Putin stand on that at the moment with this new Iranian administration as well?
So I think what we have to take into account is that Russia and Israel have different threat perceptions in terms of Iran. So the Russians are not particularly interested in Iranians going all the way and becoming a military sort of nuclear power, but at the same time they're less risk averse towards that outcome. So the Russians are playing, in a way, you can say that it's a double game. Yes, on the one hand they're part of the discussions, and they want to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, but on the other hand they are also sort of more understanding towards Iranian demands. They don't want to give too much to the US.